The early morning air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of dew and distant wood smoke. John Harper stood on his porch, sipping his usual black coffee as the sun began its slow ascent over the Kansas plains. The horizon stretched endlessly, dotted with wheat fields, weathered fences, and patches of untouched prairie grass. It was a view that he'd grown to cherish, steady, unchanging, a stark contrast to the unpredictability of life itself. As he drained the last of his coffee, his attention was drawn to an unusual sound coming from the barn. Daisy, his trusted chestnut mare, was neighing and stomping restlessly. John frowned. Daisy wasn't the excitable type. She had always been a calm, even-tempered horse, known for her reliability. If she was distressed, something was off. John set his mug down on the porch railing and pulled on his worn leather jacket. His boots crunched against the gravel as he made his way toward the paddock. Daisy stood near the fence line, her ears pinned forward, her large brown eyes fixated on the grove of trees at the edge of his property. "Morning, girl," John greeted, his voice steady but curious. He ran a hand down Daisy's neck, feeling the tension in her muscles. "What's got you all worked up, huh?" Daisy responded with a snort, pawing at the ground. Her behavior made John uneasy. He turned his gaze toward the direction she was fixated on, the tree line that marked the beginning of an overgrown path leading to an old limestone cave. It had been years since he'd ventured that way, but he knew it well, a secluded, almost forgotten corner of his land, rarely disturbed by anyone. "Something out there, Daisy?" John muttered, his voice tinged with skepticism. Coyotes weren't uncommon in the area, and occasionally stray dogs roamed the fields. But this felt different. Daisy's urgency wasn't the kind of alarm she showed around animals. It was something else. He hesitated for a moment before heading back to the barn to grab his flashlight and a sturdy walking stick. "Guess I better take a look," he muttered to himself. Daisy let out a soft whinny, as if encouraging him. The path was rough and overgrown, evidence of years of neglect. Fallen branches and patches of thistle made it slow going. But John pressed on, guided by the faint light filtering through the canopy of trees above. The limestone cave lay at the heart of the grove, its entrance shrouded in shadows and vines. It had been a place of boyhood adventures for John, but now it seemed almost foreboding. As he neared the cave, he noticed an unnatural stillness in the air. Even the birds seemed quiet. The only sound was the crunch of his boots against the gravel and the distant rustle of leaves in the wind. "Hello?" John called out, his voice echoing off the jagged limestone walls. He wasn't expecting a response. It was more habit than anything. But as the echo faded, he heard it. A sound so faint it was almost drowned out by the wind. A muffled cry. He froze, his grip tightening on the walking stick. His heart thudded against his ribs as he strained to listen. The cry came again, softer this time but unmistakably human. Someone was inside. "Hey, is someone in there?" he called, stepping closer. The smell hit him first, a sour mix of damp earth and sweat. It sent a chill down his spine. Cautiously, he aimed the flashlight into the cave's mouth, the beam cutting through the darkness. At first, all he saw were the uneven walls and scattered rocks. But then, in the far corner, something shifted. A figure, small, hunched, and barely moving. "Jesus," John whispered under his breath. He took another step forward, squinting to make out the scene. It was a woman, her clothes torn and dirty, clutching two small bundles to her chest. Even in the dim light, he could see her hollow cheeks, her trembling hands. The bundles in her arms stirred, and he realized with a jolt that they were infants. "Ma'am." John's voice was softer now, careful not to startle her. He knelt down, keeping a safe distance. "It's okay. I'm not gonna hurt you. My name's John. I live just up the road." The woman didn't respond. Her eyes darted toward him, wide with fear, but she didn't speak. She held the babies closer, her body shielding them as if expecting an attack. John's chest tightened. "You're safe now, all right? Let me help you. I can take you somewhere warm. Get you and the babies some food." He inched closer, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. "Please let me help." The woman's lips parted, but no sound came out. Tears welled in her eyes as she finally nodded, ever so slightly. John let out a shaky breath, relief washing over him. "All right," he said, standing up and extending a hand. "We'll take it slow. I'll get you out of here." As he helped her to her feet, the enormity of the situation began to sink in. Whoever she was, whatever had brought her to this cave, it was clear she had been through something unimaginable. And now, for better or worse, her survival depended on him. The climb back to the farm was grueling. The woman, barely able to stand, leaned heavily on John as he supported her. The two infants in her arms, wrapped in makeshift blankets, remained eerily quiet, a silence that John knew was a bad sign. Babies should cry, should fuss. These children seemed too weak to do either. John cast quick glances at the woman as they made their way up the path. She was young, maybe in her late 20s, with matted hair and a pale, gaunt face. Her clothes, once simple and practical, were now tattered and caked with mud. She hadn't said a word since the cave, her lips pressed into a tight line, her eyes darting nervously at every sound. "Almost there," John murmured, more to himself than to her. His ranch came into view as they crested the hill, the red barn standing against the backdrop of endless plains. Daisy was waiting by the paddock, her ears perked up as if she knew something extraordinary was happening. The woman stumbled, and John tightened his grip. "Easy now," he said, his voice gentle. "We'll get you inside, out of this cold." The warmth of the farmhouse hit them as soon as John opened the door. It was a modest home, with wooden floors and a stone fireplace that dominated the living room. The scent of burning logs filled the air, mingling with the faint aroma of coffee that lingered from earlier that morning. "Here, sit down," John instructed, guiding the woman to the old couch near the fire. She collapsed onto the cushions, clutching the babies tightly. John grabbed a quilt from the back of a chair and draped it over her shoulders. "I'll get some water." As he filled a glass in the kitchen, his mind raced. Who was she? Where had she come from? And why had she ended up in that cave, of all places? The nearest town was miles away, and the area wasn't exactly a thoroughfare for travelers. He didn't need answers right away, but the questions gnawed at him all the same. Returning to the living room, he crouched down and held out the glass. "Here," he said softly, "drink. You've got to stay hydrated." The woman hesitated, her eyes flicking between him and the water. Finally, she took the glass with a trembling hand and drank in small, cautious sips. The babies stirred, and John's heart ached at how frail they looked, tiny faces pale, their breaths shallow. "You got names?" John asked, keeping his voice low, non-threatening. The woman looked at him for a long moment, her expression a mixture of fear and exhaustion. Finally, she whispered, her voice hoarse, "Emily." John nodded. "All right, Emily. You're safe now. I'll make sure of that." He glanced at the babies. "And these little ones?" Emily's lips quivered. "Liam," she said, nodding toward the baby in her left arm. "And Ella." Her voice cracked as she said the names, tears welling in her eyes. "Please, don't let them." Hey, John interrupted gently, raising a hand. "No one's taking them from you. You've got my word." The rest of the day was a blur of careful, deliberate action. John fetched warm milk and fed it to the babies drop by drop, using an old medicine syringe he found in the kitchen drawer. He cooked a simple broth for Emily, encouraging her to take slow sips while she stared into the fire, her hands never straying far from Liam and Ella. As night fell, Emily finally spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you." John, seated in the armchair across from her, gave a small nod. "You don't have to thank me," he said. "Just glad I found you when I did." There was a long pause before she said, "I didn't think anyone would." John felt a pang in his chest. Whatever had driven her to that cave, it was clear she had been running from something or someone. He didn't press her for details. Not yet. She needed rest, not interrogation. "You'll stay here tonight," John said firmly. "No arguing. Tomorrow, we'll figure out the rest." Emily hesitated, then nodded, her shoulders sagging as if a weight had been lifted. For the first time, she let herself lean back into the couch, her grip on the babies loosening just slightly. John stoked the fire before heading to the kitchen to prepare for the long night ahead. He'd set up the guest room for Emily and the kids, but he knew he wouldn't sleep much. His mind was already racing with what needed to be done. Medical help, supplies, and possibly even dealing with the town's whispers once word got out. As he glanced back at the living room, he saw Daisy standing by the window, her head tilted as if watching over the fragile scene inside. John smiled faintly. "Good girl," he murmured. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he wasn't facing them alone. Morning arrived in the quiet way it often did on the Kansas plains, the rising sun casting a golden glow over the farm's fields. Inside the farmhouse, however, the atmosphere was far from tranquil. John woke early, his mind already focused on the daunting tasks ahead. The situation wasn't just unusual, it was delicate, and one wrong move could put Emily and the babies at even greater risk. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the kitchen as John prepared breakfast. He cracked a few eggs into a pan and fried up some bacon, knowing the hearty smell might help coax Emily into eating more. In the living room, she sat on the couch, her thin frame hunched over as she watched the fire crackle. Liam and Ella were wrapped tightly in blankets, lying on makeshift bedding John had arranged on the couch beside her. He brought a plate of food into the room and set it on the table. "Here," he said, his tone calm and reassuring. "You need to eat." Emily glanced at the plate, her eyes hesitant but grateful. Thank you," she murmured, picking up the fork with trembling fingers. She took a small bite, chewing slowly. John sat in the armchair across from her, sipping his coffee. "You're gonna need your strength, especially with 2 little ones depending on you." Her gaze dropped to the floor, a shadow passing over her face. "I didn't think we'd make it," she admitted after a moment, her voice barely audible. "Well, you did," John said firmly. "You're here now, and we'll figure it out." After breakfast, John busied himself with farm chores, but his thoughts kept returning to Emily. There were practical issues to consider: clothing, food, medical attention. But beyond that, there was the question of safety. Whoever or whatever Emily had been running from, it was clear she wasn't out of danger yet. When he returned to the house, Emily was standing near the window, holding Liam in her arms while Ella slept on the couch. She turned when she heard the door open, her expression cautious but less guarded than the night before. "I need to know what you're running from," John said gently, leaning against the doorframe. "I'm not trying to pry, but if I'm going to help you, I need to understand what we're dealing with." Emily hesitated, her arms tightening around Liam. Her lips parted, but no words came out. John waited, his steady gaze encouraging but patient. Finally, she took a shaky breath. "It was my husband," she said, her voice trembling. "He wasn't a good man. When I got pregnant, I thought maybe he'd change, but he didn't. Things got worse." Her voice broke, and she looked away, tears brimming in her eyes. John nodded slowly, his jaw tightening. He had suspected something like this, but hearing it confirmed made his chest ache. "In the cave?" he asked. Emily wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "I ran," she said simply. "We didn't have anywhere else to go. I thought if I could just get far enough away, we'd be safe." John let out a long breath, his mind working quickly. "Well, you're safe here," he said. "But the town's small, and people talk. If anyone comes looking, it won't take long for word to spread." Emily's face paled. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. John crossed the room and crouched beside her, his tone steady and resolute. "First, we take care of you and the kids. Then, we get a plan together. I know a lawyer in town. He's a good man. He'll know what to do about keeping you safe." That afternoon, John loaded Daisy with supplies and headed into Willow Creek. The town was small, with a single main street lined with modest shops and businesses. As John tied Daisy to a post near the general store, he felt the familiar stares of curious neighbors. "Morning, John," called George, the store's owner, from the porch. "Haven't seen you in town for a spell. Everything all right out there?" John forced a smile, keeping his tone light. "Just needed to stock up on a few things. Running low on supplies." George nodded but didn't press further, though John could feel his eyes lingering as he stepped into the store. He quickly gathered what he needed: canned goods, diapers, and baby formula, and made his way to the counter. The cashier, a young woman named Claire, raised an eyebrow at the unusual purchases but didn't say anything. By the time John returned to the farm, Emily was waiting by the window, visibly relieved to see him. "I got what we need for now," he said, setting the bags down on the kitchen table. "We'll take it one step at a time." Emily nodded, a glimmer of hope in her eyes. For the first time, she allowed herself to smile, albeit faintly. It wasn't much, but it was a start. As John settled in for the evening, he couldn't help but feel the weight of what lay ahead. Helping Emily and the babies was the right thing to do. He didn't doubt that. But the road to safety and stability would be anything but easy. Still, as he glanced at the couch where Liam and Ella now slept peacefully, he knew he wouldn't have it any other way. The following days were a blur of activity and quiet determination. John adjusted his routine to accommodate the fragile presence of Emily and her babies. The farmhouse, which had long been a place of solitude, now hummed with new life. Liam and Ella cried softly at night, their weak voices breaking the stillness, while Emily tended to them with a mixture of tenderness and exhaustion. John quickly realized that Emily needed more than just food and shelter. She needed stability and reassurance. Her movements were cautious, her eyes constantly darting to windows as if expecting someone to appear. It was clear that the trauma of her past hadn't loosened its grip on her. The mornings began early, as they always had on the farm. John would rise before dawn, preparing coffee and checking on the animals. Daisy, as if understanding the gravity of the situation, seemed calmer now, staying near the house and occasionally nudging Emily with her soft muzzle when the young woman ventured outside. One morning, John entered the living room with 2 steaming mugs of coffee. Emily was seated by the fireplace, rocking Ella gently while Liam dozed in a bassinet John had retrieved from the attic. It had belonged to his niece years ago, but now it found a new purpose. "You take milk or sugar?" John asked, holding out the mug. Emily looked up, startled by the question. "Oh, just black," she said softly, accepting the mug with both hands. "Good," John replied with a faint smile. "That's the only way I make it." Emily managed a small laugh, the sound almost foreign after days of silence. It was a brief moment of levity, but it lightened the room. Later that afternoon, as John worked on repairing a fence near the barn, Emily approached cautiously, Liam strapped to her chest in a makeshift sling. She held a basket of fresh laundry, her steps tentative as she neared the paddock. "You don't have to do that," John said, wiping sweat from his brow as he glanced up from his work. "I want to help," Emily replied, her voice steady but quiet. "You've done so much already. I can't just sit inside all day." John nodded, recognizing the determination in her voice. "All right, just take it easy. No sense in overworking yourself." Emily smiled faintly and began hanging the clothes on a line near the barn. Daisy ambled over, her ears twitching as she observed the scene. The horse stood close to Emily, nudging her shoulder gently with her nose. "She likes you," John remarked, watching the interaction with a touch of amusement. Emily ran a hand along Daisy's neck, her expression softening. "She's comforting," she admitted. "It's like she knows." John leaned against the fence, his gaze thoughtful. "Animals are funny that way. They pick up on things we don't." By evening, the farm felt almost serene. Emily sat on the porch with the babies, her eyes fixed on the horizon as the sun dipped below the fields. John joined her, carrying a plate of biscuits he had baked earlier, a skill he had picked up out of necessity but rarely flaunted. "Not bad," Emily said after taking a bite, her tone lighter than he had heard before. "High praise," John replied with a chuckle. The silence that followed was comfortable, a stark contrast to the tension of their first meeting. Emily shifted slightly, adjusting Liam in her arms. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, her voice tinged with emotion. "You don't need to," John said simply. "Just focus on getting better." "That's thanks enough." Emily nodded, her expression thoughtful as she gazed out at the vast expanse of farmland. For the first time in a long while, she felt a glimmer of hope, a sense that maybe, just maybe, she and her children could start over. As John stoked the fire later that night, he found himself reflecting on the day. Emily's resilience, though fragile, was beginning to show, and the babies were growing stronger with each passing hour. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, but in moments like these, it felt manageable, like they could face whatever came their way. For now, that was enough. It didn't take long for the quiet town of Willow Creek to catch wind of the new occupants at John Harper's farm. The community, tight-knit and conservative, thrived on shared stories and whispered speculation. John rarely ventured into town unless necessary, but the unusual purchases of baby supplies and his visibly distracted demeanor during his last visit had raised more than a few eyebrows. At the heart of the town's murmurs was George Carter, the owner of Willow Creek General Store and an unofficial leader among the townsfolk. George prided himself on knowing everyone's business, and John's sudden secrecy didn't sit well with him. "Have you heard about John Harper?" Claire, the young cashier from the store, asked as she stocked shelves. George grunted, pausing his tally at the register. "What about him?" "He came in last week, bought baby formula and diapers. Haven't seen him around much since." George scratched his chin. His curiosity piqued. "A bachelor like him? What's he doing with baby supplies?" Claire shrugged. "Maybe he's helping someone out? It's not like John to do anything shady." George leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing. "Helping someone? Huh? Well, I'm sure we'll find out soon enough." Meanwhile, back at the farm, Emily was beginning to settle into a routine. She had grown more comfortable in the farmhouse, though her nerves remained frayed. Every time John drove into town for supplies, she would pace by the window, clutching Liam or Ella tightly to her chest. Her paranoia was palpable, and John noticed. One afternoon, after unloading feed from the truck, he found Emily sitting on the porch steps, her expression distant. "Something on your mind?" John asked, sitting down beside her. Emily glanced at him, hesitant. Do you think people in town know about us?" John sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Small town like this? People are bound to talk. But I haven't said anything about you or the kids. That's your story to tell, not mine." Emily looked relieved but still wary. "I'm just scared. What if someone figures out who I am? What if—" "Hey," John interrupted, his voice firm but kind. "No one's gonna hurt you here. I won't let that happen." Her eyes welled with tears, but she quickly wiped them away. "Thank you," she whispered. The next day, John's fears about the town's curiosity became reality. George and two other men arrived at the farm unannounced, their truck kicking up dust as it pulled into the driveway. Daisy, grazing near the paddock, neighed uneasily, sensing the tension in the air. John stepped out onto the porch, his posture stiff. "Morning, George," he greeted, his tone neutral. "Morning, John," George replied, tipping his hat. "Hope you don't mind us stopping by. Thought we'd check in on you. See how things are going." John crossed his arms, his gaze steady. "Everything's fine. Busy, as usual." George exchanged a glance with the others. "Heard you've had some company out here. Some folks are saying there's a woman and a couple of kids staying with you." John's jaw tightened. "You hear a lot of things in town, don't you?" George chuckled, though it lacked humor. "Well, you know how it is. People talk. Just thought we'd ask directly." John took a step forward, his voice lowering. "What happens on my farm is my business, George. I don't appreciate you coming here to pry." George's smile faded, replaced by a more serious expression. "We're not looking to cause trouble, John. But if there's someone here who shouldn't be, the town has a right to know." John's eyes flashed with anger, but he kept his composure. "Emily and her kids are staying here because they need help. That's all you need to know. Now, if you don't mind, I've got work to do." George opened his mouth as if to argue, but thought better of it. With a curt nod, he turned and walked back to the truck, the other men following. As the dust settled from their departure, John exhaled deeply, his hands clenching into fists. He knew this wouldn't be the end of it. Inside the house, Emily was standing near the window, having watched the exchange. "They know, don't they?" she asked, her voice trembling. John nodded. "They suspect, but I told them the truth. You're here because you needed help. Nothing else matters." Emily hugged Liam closer, her expression torn between gratitude and fear. I don't want to cause you any trouble, John. You're not causing trouble, he said firmly. They'll talk, sure, but I'm not backing down. You and the kids have every right to be here. For the first time, Emily felt a small spark of courage. John's unwavering support gave her a sliver of hope that maybe, just maybe, they could face whatever challenges lay ahead, together. The morning sun rose over the Kansas plains, casting long shadows across the farm as the first signs of autumn began to paint the landscape in warm hues of gold and orange. Inside the farmhouse, life had settled into a new rhythm. Emily had started to come out of her shell, slowly finding small ways to contribute to the daily work, despite her lingering fears. And through it all, Daisy seemed to have taken on the role of an unlikely guardian. The bond between Emily and the chestnut mare had formed almost immediately. Daisy, with her steady demeanor and soulful eyes, seemed to sense Emily's vulnerability. It wasn't uncommon to find Emily standing by the paddock in the early mornings, her hands resting gently on Daisy's neck as she whispered softly. John, who often watched these moments from the porch, couldn't help but marvel at the connection. One crisp afternoon, Emily decided to help John with some chores around the barn. Liam and Ella were tucked safely inside the house, fast asleep in a makeshift crib, giving her a rare moment of freedom. As she worked alongside John, Daisy wandered over, her tail swishing lazily. She really seems to like you, John remarked, handing Emily a pitchfork to help spread fresh hay. Emily smiled faintly, brushing a strand of hair from her face. She's calming, she admitted. When I'm near her, it feels like everything slows down, like I can breathe again. John nodded thoughtfully. Horses are like that. They pick up on things, feelings, moods. Daisy's always been good at that. Emily reached out, running her hand along Daisy's flank. I didn't think I'd ever feel safe again, she said quietly. But here, with her, it's like, I don't know, like maybe things can be okay. John leaned on the pitchfork, his expression softening. They will be, Emily. It's not going to happen overnight, but you'll get there. As the days passed, Daisy became an integral part of Emily's healing. She began spending more time outside, often sitting by the paddock with the babies, watching Daisy graze. The mare would occasionally wander over, nudging Liam and Ella with her nose, eliciting soft giggles from the infants. It was a simple, unspoken bond that brought comfort to both Emily and her children. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange, Emily found herself walking along the edge of the pasture. Daisy followed close behind, her hooves crunching softly against the dirt. Emily stopped and turned to face the horse, her eyes brimming with tears. Thank you, she whispered, her voice trembling, for being here. For everything, Daisy nickered softly, as if acknowledging her words. Emily reached out, resting her forehead against the mare's warm neck, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to cry. It wasn't the helpless, panicked sobbing of someone trapped in fear, but the cathartic release of someone finally beginning to heal. That night, as Emily settled the babies to sleep, John sat by the fireplace, repairing an old saddle. When Emily joined him, he glanced up, noting the peaceful expression on her face. You seem lighter, he said, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. Emily nodded, sitting across from him. I think Daisy's doing more for me than I realized. She's helping me let go of some things. John's smile widened. She's always had a way of doing that. Guess she knew you needed her. Emily hesitated, then said, I've never had anyone, or anything, be so constant. Daisy just accepts me. No questions, no expectations. That's what makes her special, John replied. She doesn't need answers. She just knows. The connection between Emily and Daisy didn't go unnoticed by the community. On the rare occasions John ventured into town, he overheard whispers about the woman with the babies and how she'd taken to that horse of his. The townsfolk, ever curious, speculated endlessly, but John paid them no mind. He knew that Daisy was more than a horse to Emily. She was a lifeline, a source of strength when everything else felt uncertain. For Emily, the bond with Daisy became a symbol of her resilience. Each day spent with the mare was a reminder that healing was possible, even in the wake of unimaginable hardship. And as the days turned into weeks, she began to believe, little by little, that maybe, just maybe, she and her children could find a way to rebuild their lives. The autumn wind carried the faint scent of hay and damp earth as Emily sat in the quiet of the farmhouse one evening. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, its light dancing across the room's worn furniture. Liam and Ella slept peacefully in the small crib John had built, their rhythmic breathing the only other sound. Emily watched them for a long time, her expression a mixture of love and sorrow. John entered from the kitchen, drying his hands on a towel. "You've been quiet tonight," he observed, his tone gentle. Emily glanced up at him, her eyes shadowed with thoughts she had long kept buried. "There's something I need to tell you," she said softly, her voice trembling. John pulled up a chair and sat across from her, his rugged face lined with concern. "Take your time," he said, his tone steady. Emily drew a shaky breath, her hands twisting in her lap. "I've been running for months," she began. "From him. From everything." Her voice broke, and she took a moment to collect herself. "My husband, Stephen, he wasn't the man I thought he was when we got married. At first, it was just anger. A sharp word here, a slammed door there. But after I got pregnant, things got worse." John's hands tightened into fists on the table, but he said nothing, allowing her to continue. "When the twins were born, I thought maybe it would change him," Emily said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But it didn't. He became crueler, more controlling. She paused, swallowing hard. "He hurt me, more times than I can count." John's jaw clenched, his eyes blazing with quiet fury. "And the twins?" Emily shook her head, her tears spilling over. "He never laid a hand on them. But I couldn't wait for that to change. I knew I had to get out before he did." She fell silent for a moment, her gaze distant. "I waited until he left for work one morning, packed whatever I could carry, and took the babies. I didn't have a plan. I just knew I had to run. I stayed in shelters, slept in the car when I had to. But I ran out of places to go, out of money. That's how I ended up in the cave." John leaned forward, his voice low and fierce. "You did the right thing, Emily. Getting out, protecting your kids, that took strength. More strength than he'll ever have." Emily met his eyes, her tears glistening in the firelight. "I don't feel strong. I feel broken." John shook his head. "You're not broken. You're here, and you're fighting for those babies. That's not broken. That's brave." The fire crackled softly as they sat in silence for a while. Finally, Emily spoke again, her voice stronger this time. "I know I can't stay hidden forever. He'll be looking for us." John's expression hardened. "If he comes anywhere near this place, he'll regret it." Emily looked at him, her fear and gratitude mingling. "I don't want to bring trouble to you, John. You've done so much already." "Emily," John said firmly, "this is your home now. You and those kids are safe here, and I'll make damn sure it stays that way." That night, Emily slept more soundly than she had in months. The weight of her secret, though still heavy, felt lighter now that she had shared it. And for the first time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't alone in this fight. In the barn, Daisy stirred in her stall, her ears twitching at the distant sound of the wind. Outside, the Kansas plains stretched endlessly under a blanket of stars, a quiet witness to the fragile but growing strength within the farmhouse. The next morning, the calm of the farm was disrupted by the distant sound of tires crunching on gravel. John, who had been mending a fence near the barn, straightened up and shaded his eyes as a familiar truck rolled up the driveway. Inside were George Carter and two other men, their expressions tight and determined. Daisy, grazing nearby, lifted her head, her ears flicking nervously. Emily, who had been helping feed the chickens with Liam in a sling, froze at the sound. She quickly turned toward the house, her body tense, instinctively shielding her child. John met the truck as it came to a halt, his posture firm. George climbed out first, adjusting his hat, followed by the other two, who stayed close behind. Their presence was heavy with unspoken accusations. "Mornin'," John," George greeted, though there was no warmth in his tone. "Morning," John replied flatly, wiping his hands on a rag. "Something I can help you with?" George exchanged a glance with his companions before speaking. "Word around town is you've got someone staying here. A woman with 2 kids. People are starting to ask questions." John's jaw tightened. "What happens on my land is my business." George stepped closer, his voice lowering. "Now, we all know you're a good man, John, but folks are worried. If there's someone here who doesn't belong, someone who might bring trouble, we've got a right to know." John took a deliberate step forward, his tone ice cold. "What you've got is a lot of nerve, George, coming onto my property and making demands. Emily and her kids are here because they needed help. That's all you need to know." One of the other men, a wiry figure named Tom, spoke up. "We're just looking out for the town, John. You can't blame folks for wanting to keep things safe." John's eyes narrowed. "Safe? You think turning your back on people in need makes this place safe? If that's the kind of town you want, maybe you're the ones who don't belong here." George held up a hand, his voice tight with frustration. "No one's saying we don't care. But there are laws, John. And if you're harboring someone who's got complications, it could come back on all of us." John's temper flared, but he kept his voice steady. "Emily isn't your problem, George. She's mine, and I'll handle whatever comes our way. Now, unless you've got something helpful to say, I suggest you get back in your truck and leave." George hesitated, his pride and curiosity warring within him. Finally, he nodded, though his expression remained stiff. "Suit yourself, John. But don't say we didn't warn you." As the truck rumbled back down the driveway, John turned to find Emily watching from the porch, her face pale and drawn. He walked over, his shoulders still tense. "They're gone," he said simply, climbing the steps. "But they'll keep talking." Emily's voice was barely above a whisper. "What if they call someone? The police, or worse?" John placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Let them. I've already started talking to a lawyer in town. If it comes to it, we'll file for protection. But you're not going anywhere unless you want to." Tears welled in Emily's eyes, but she quickly blinked them away. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, her voice breaking. "You don't have to," John replied. "We'll get through this together." That night, the tension lingered in the air, but the farmhouse felt like a fortress, a safe haven against the outside world. Emily sat by the fire, feeding Liam while Ella slept soundly. John worked quietly at the table, sorting through papers and notes from his conversation with the lawyer. "John," Emily said suddenly, breaking the silence. He looked up. "Yeah." Her voice was steady, though her eyes shimmered with emotion. "I don't think I've ever met anyone like you. Someone who does the right thing just because it's right." John leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "Maybe it's not about being right. Maybe it's about knowing what you can live with." He paused, then added, "And I couldn't live with turning my back on you and those kids." Emily nodded, her gaze dropping to the sleeping baby in her arms. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe that John's determination might just be enough to protect them. The winds howled softly outside, carrying the whispers of a town caught between suspicion and compassion. Inside the farmhouse, however, there was a growing strength, a fragile but undeniable bond between 2 people determined to do the right thing, no matter the cost. A week passed, and the air around the farm grew heavier with tension. The rumors in Willow Creek had not subsided. Instead, they seemed to gain momentum. Emily stayed inside most days, keeping to the back rooms with Liam and Ella, while John worked harder than ever to maintain a sense of normalcy. But both of them knew it was only a matter of time before the whispers turned into something more. That moment came on a chilly Friday morning. The sound of car engines shattered the quiet stillness of the farm. John looked up from the barn, his gut tightening as 2 black SUVs pulled into the driveway. Their polished exteriors and tinted windows stood out starkly against the rustic simplicity of the farm. Emily peeked out from the kitchen window, her face draining of color. "John," she called, her voice trembling. "I see them," John said, stepping out into the yard. His boots crunched on the gravel as he approached the vehicles, his face a mask of calm determination. Two men in suits exited the first SUV, followed by a woman with a clipboard in hand. Their presence screamed official business. "Mr. Harper?" the woman asked, her tone professional but clipped. "That's me," John replied, his voice steady. "What can I do for you?" She extended a hand. "Agent Matthews, Department of Homeland Security. We've received reports about an individual staying on your property. A woman with 2 children. We're here to investigate." John didn't flinch. He crossed his arms, his stance unyielding. "Emily and her kids are staying here because they need help. That's not a crime." Agent Matthews exchanged a glance with one of the men, then turned back to John. "We understand your concern, Mr. Harper, but if this woman is undocumented or fleeing legal issues, it becomes a matter of federal interest. We need to speak with her." John stepped forward, his voice hardening. "She's not running from the law. She's running from a man who hurt her. And unless you're here to protect her from him, I don't see how this is your concern." The agent's expression softened slightly, but she held her ground. "If she's seeking asylum, there are legal steps that need to be taken. We need to verify her situation and ensure the children's safety." "Emily and her kids are safe here," John said firmly. "But if you need to talk to her, you'll do it on my terms. She's been through enough without being ambushed by strangers in suits." Agent Matthews hesitated, then nodded. "Fair enough. May we come inside?" Inside the farmhouse, Emily sat on the couch, her arms wrapped protectively around Liam and Ella. Her face was pale, but her eyes held a quiet resolve. John walked in ahead of the agents, his presence a reassuring anchor. "Emily," he said gently, kneeling beside her. "They're from the government. They want to talk to you about your situation. I'll be right here the whole time." Emily's hands trembled as she adjusted Liam's blanket. She nodded, her voice barely audible. "Okay." Agent Matthews sat across from her, adopting a softer tone. "Miss Porter, we're here to help, not to hurt you. Can you tell us about your circumstances? Why you're here?" Emily hesitated, her gaze flicking to John. His calm expression gave her the strength to speak. She recounted her story, the abuse, the escape, the endless nights of fear and exhaustion. Her voice wavered, but she didn't stop, driven by the need to protect her children. The agents listened intently, their expressions unreadable. When Emily finished, Agent Matthews nodded slowly. "Thank you for sharing that, Miss Porter. It's clear you've been through a great deal. We'll need to confirm some details, but your account aligns with what we've seen in similar cases." John leaned forward, his voice steady. "What happens now?" Agent Matthews folded her hands. "If her story checks out, she may be eligible for AT visa or asylum protections as a survivor of trafficking or abuse. We'll work with local organizations to help her file the necessary paperwork." Emily's relief was palpable, but her brow furrowed. What if he finds us?" Agent Matthews's voice softened. "If you're granted asylum or a visa, law enforcement can help ensure your safety. We'll also look into temporary protective measures in the meantime." The meeting stretched into the afternoon, with John's farmhouse transformed into an impromptu legal consultation. By the time the agents left, Emily looked exhausted but hopeful. John walked the agents to their cars, stopping Agent Matthews before she got inside. "She's been through hell," John said quietly. "Make sure this doesn't put her through more." Agent Matthews met his gaze. "We'll do our best, Mr. Harper. Thank you for stepping up for her." That night, the farmhouse was quieter than usual. Emily sat by the fire, rocking Ella in her arms, while John prepared tea in the kitchen. When he brought her a cup, she looked up, her expression a mixture of gratitude and lingering fear. "Do you think it'll work?" she asked softly. John sat beside her, his tone firm. "I don't just think it will. I know it will. One step at a time, Emily. We'll get there." For the first time in months, Emily allowed herself to believe him. The days following the visit from the Department of Homeland Security were a whirlwind of paperwork, phone calls, and quiet moments of reflection. Emily found herself navigating a process she had never imagined, a legal fight for her and her children's safety. But amidst the chaos, the farm provided a sanctuary, a place where life followed its own steady rhythm. John took the lead on most of the logistics. He reached out to a local nonprofit organization that specialized in helping survivors of domestic violence. The lawyer he had contacted, a no-nonsense woman named Susan Turner, took on Emily's case pro bono, drafting the necessary applications for AT visa and advising on how to handle any inquiries from Stephen or his representatives. Her involvement brought a sense of structure to the uncertainty. One cool afternoon, Emily stood in the barn, brushing Daisy's coat. The mare leaned into her touch, her large eyes blinking slowly as if to say, "You're safe here." Emily often found herself talking to Daisy in these quiet moments, sharing thoughts and fears she couldn't yet voice to John or anyone else. "You don't judge me, do you, girl?" she whispered, running the brush down Daisy's flank. "You just listen." "I needed that." Daisy nickered softly, nudging Emily's shoulder with her nose. Emily smiled, a flicker of light breaking through the lingering darkness. Inside the house, John was going over documents with Susan at the kitchen table. Emily walked in, her cheeks flushed from the cool air. She paused, hesitating at the sight of the papers spread across the table. "Emily," Susan greeted with a nod, her tone brisk but kind. "We're making progress. Your application is almost ready to submit. We're also drafting a statement to present to the authorities if Stephen tries to contest custody of the children." Emily sat down, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "Do you think he'll come after us?" she asked, her voice trembling. Susan's expression softened. "It's a possibility, but we're building a strong case. With John's statement and the evidence you've provided, you have a solid chance of being granted asylum or protected status." Emily looked at John, her eyes glistening. "You're really doing all this for me? For us?" John reached across the table, resting a hand on hers. "You and those kids deserve a chance to live without fear. That's worth fighting for." The farm became a place of cautious optimism. Emily started to embrace the routines of life there, helping John with small tasks and spending more time outdoors with Liam and Ella. The babies, who had once been so frail, began to thrive. Their laughter filled the farmhouse, a sound so pure and joyful it brought tears to Emily's eyes more than once. One evening, after putting the twins to bed, Emily joined John on the porch. The stars were scattered across the sky, their light bright and unwavering. She pulled her cardigan tighter around her shoulders, the cool air brushing her skin. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't found us," she said quietly. John looked out over the fields, his expression thoughtful. "Funny thing about life," he said. "Sometimes it gives you exactly what you need, even if you don't know you're looking for it." Emily smiled, her gaze following his. "You're a good man, John. The world needs more people like you." John chuckled softly. "I don't know about that, but I do know this farm's a better place with you and those little ones around." As the days turned into weeks, the community's interest in Emily began to wane. The persistent rumors gave way to new topics of conversation, and the farm fell back into relative obscurity. But for Emily and John, the journey was far from over. There were still hurdles to face, papers to file, and the looming uncertainty of Stephen's next move. Yet, in the quiet moments, there was hope, a fragile but growing belief that they were building something stronger than fear. One morning, as the sun rose over the plains, Emily stood by the paddock, watching Daisy graze. She felt a strange sense of peace, a feeling she hadn't experienced in years. She knew the road ahead would be difficult, but for the first time, she believed they could face it together. Leave your like, subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and if you watched all the way through, comment "I watched all the way through" and share your opinion about this story. Oh, and don't forget to watch the next video on the end screen. It's incredibly exciting.